The book of Genesis contains a very strange passage that describes the sons of God marrying the daughters of men. It also describes a mysterious group known as the Nephilim. In recent years, a lot of people have tried to explain this passage, claiming that the Nephilim are anything from aliens to Bigfoot. Others have said that the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim are all just humans. In this episode, I'm going to tell you what the evidence suggests about who these groups actually are in the text. Let's get into it. Howdy, folks. We're in our second year of the podcast now, and you can help me keep making this podcast for years to come and get yourself early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. In Genesis 6, it contains a very strange passage which says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Biblical scholars of all persuasions recognize that this is one of the most mysterious passages in the Old Testament, and the reason for this is that the author of Genesis is giving us a summary account of a much longer story that's not found in the Bible. Among the things we'd like to be able to figure out are the following. 1. Who are the sons of God in this passage? 2. Who are the daughters of men? 3. Why does God say that man's days shall be 120 years? 4. Who were the Nephilim? 5. What is the relationship between the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim? 6. Why does the text say that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward? 7. Do these events have anything to do with the Great Flood, which this passage introduces? Multiple theories have been proposed to answer these questions, and some of them are really wild. One that has been extremely common in pop culture in the last few years was proposed by Zecharia Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-American journalist who claimed to have taught himself Sumerian cuneiform, and he profoundly affected the popular conception of the Nephilim in modern culture. According to Sitchin, Mesopotamian tablets reveal that there is a planet in the outer solar system called Nibiru that has a highly elliptical orbit and that swings through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, though don't worry, it's not due again till around AD 2900. According to Sitchin, Nibiru is inhabited by a race of aliens that the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, and that Genesis calls the Nephilim. That's right, the Nephilim are aliens, because it's always aliens, or demons. When serious Christians hear this claim for the first time, they can be tempted to dismiss it out of hand, and as far as believing in it, that's the right instinct. No Christian should take Sitchin's claim seriously for reasons we'll get into. However, not believing something doesn't mean not interacting with it, because if you want to do apologetics and be serious about it, you have to be willing to interact with ideas that are out there in the culture, and this is one of them. If you want to help people find their way to Christian faith, you have to help them take a look at the evidence for the faith, and that includes evidence that Sitchin's understanding of Genesis is simply mistaken. One of the individuals who called attention to this was Dr. Michael Heiser, a Protestant scholar of the Old Testament and Semitic languages, who critiqued Sitchin's work in a variety of venues, including on his provocatively named website, SitchinIsWrong.com. Unlike Sitchin, Heiser was not self-taught. He had an accredited PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages, which include the cuneiform that Sitchin claimed to have learned. Over and over again, Heiser showed problems with Sitchin's claims, most of which concerned Mesopotamian writings that he falsely claimed to translate. Heiser regularly cited scholarly reference works, some of them online, so that they could be easily checked by the reader, and the truth is that Sitchin was simply making up his claims. The Sumerians did not envision a planet named Nibiru, and it was not inhabited by a race called the Anunnaki or the Nephilim. You can read Heiser's takedowns of Sitchin for yourself, but most of them concern Sitchin's claims about Mesopotamian literature rather than the Bible. Here, we're interested in the Nephilim from Genesis 6, so we'll only look at that. In keeping with his ancient astronaut theory, Sitchin claimed that the Nephilim's name meant those who came down from above in Hebrew, and that they came down in rocket ships. However, Heiser points out, Sitchin assumes Nephilim comes from the Hebrew word nephal, which usually means to fall. He then forces the meaning to come down onto the word, creating his to come down from above translation. In the form we find it in the Hebrew Bible, if the word Nephilim came from the Hebrew nephal, it would not be spelled as we find it. The form Nephilim cannot mean fallen ones. The spelling would then be Nephilim. Likewise, Nephilim does not mean those who fall or those who fall away. That would be Nephilim. The only way in Hebrew to get Nephilim from Nephal by the rules of Hebrew morphology or word formation would be to presume a noun spelled Naphil and then pluralize it. I say presume since this noun does not exist in biblical Hebrew. Instead, Heiser argues, the word Nephilim appears to be a loan word from Aramaic, where it means giants. In fact, this is how the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, renders the word in the two passages where it appears, Genesis 6:4 and Numbers 13:33. In both places, it uses the Greek word gigas, or giant. This also fits with Genesis 6:4's statement that the Nephilim were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, and with Numbers 13:32's statement that the Nephilim's descendants are of great height, and the following verse's statement that we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. This doesn't mean that they were giants the way we would think of them today. The average man in ancient Israel was just about 5 foot 5 inches tall, and according to the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Greek Septuagint, and the Jewish historian Josephus, the biblical giant Goliath was only 4 cubits and a span tall, which works out to 6 foot 6 inches. So the text doesn't ask us to envision superhumanly large giants. There's also zero evidence, contrary to what some folks say, that the Nephilim were Bigfoots. When the Israelites went into the Promised Land, they found it inhabited by big people, not big people who were covered in hair from head to foot. If they had found Sasquatches living in the Promised Land, the spies would have mentioned that the Nephilim were covered in hair, and they don't. Also, Bigfoots are not reported to be tool users, but the Canaanite inhabitants of the Promised Land, including the Nephilim, were tool users, so we have another reason to dismiss the Bigfoot claim. As fun as it may sound to some folks, it's just not supported by the evidence. If we also set aside Sitchin's unfounded claim that the Nephilim were those who came down from above in rocket ships, we thus see that the evidence points to the Nephilim being unusually tall humans or giants. That solves one of the mysteries we began with, number 4. They were giants. But now let's see if we can answer more of these questions. The one I'd like to focus on first is question 3, or why God said that man's days shall be 120 years. Some have taken this to be a declaration that man's lifespan would decrease from the centuries-long lifespans of the pre-flood patriarchs. This is possible, but there are problems with this proposal. First, people in Genesis continued living for centuries long after this announcement. Noah himself lives to be 950 years old. Other biblical figures lived for centuries, and the Israelite patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived to be 175, 180, and 147 respectively. In fact, nobody in Genesis is said to live to 120 years old, and Psalm 90:10 is frank that the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. I thus tend to favor the theory advocated in the Jewish Publication Society's commentary on Genesis, which notes early exegetes of this verse prefer to see here a reference to the interval of time remaining before the flood. In other words, the 120 years was a grace period before the Great Flood. After all, Genesis 6:3 is at the beginning of the flood narrative, and it makes sense for it to be a reference to when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. This is my proposal to the answer for question 3. God is given a 120-year grace period before the flood. Next, I'd like to look at questions 5 and 6. After the statement that the sons of God took wives from among the daughters of men, and the statement about man's days being 120 years, Genesis says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them." From the first part of this sentence, you might conclude that the unusually tall Nephilim were a new and unrelated group that the text just happens to mention being on earth before the flood. However, the second part of the sentence rules that interpretation out. It says that they were also on the earth after the flood, and it tells us when this happened. That is, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. The Nephilim are thus the children of the sons of God and the daughters of man. Answer in question 5. We can then answer question 6. The Nephilim were on the earth both before and after the flood because the sons of God and the daughters of men mated twice. Genesis 6 records one mating, but it alerts the reader that it happened a second time, which reflects Numbers 13:33, where the spies Moses sends into the promised land report that there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. The ancient reader would have known that the Israelites had encountered the Nephilim in the Promised Land, and so the author of Genesis includes this remark to explain how they could be around both before and after the flood. This provides us with a clue that can help us answer questions 1 and 2, because the sons of God and the daughters of men mated both before and after the flood. Well, then they must have been around both before and after the flood. That eliminates one of the possibilities for who they were. According to some authors, the sons of God represent the righteous line that came from Adam and Eve's son Seth, while the daughters of men were the wicked line that came from their son Cain. This Sethite-Cainite interpretation is problematic because the language of the text does not suggest it. There's nothing in this passage that mentions either Seth or Cain. So it is unsupported speculation to propose that the sons of God were the descendants of Seth. Even worse, the phrase daughters of men does not suggest the descendants of Cain. But Genesis 6:4 statement that the sons of God came into the daughters of men both before and after the flood eliminates this possibility because the line of Cain did not survive the flood. That's something we discussed in episode 55 because some racists have occasionally tried to argue that dark skin is a result of being of the line of Cain. But as Peter tells us, only a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water in Noah's Ark. Noah's family is a population bottleneck, and the way Genesis presents it, Noah's family was of the line of Seth, and the line of Cain went extinct. It's not impossible that Noah had some Cainite ancestry, but this is not indicated in the text, and the way Israelite genealogies reckoned ancestry by the male line, the line of Cain itself did not survive. We can thus eliminate one of the more popular theories regarding questions 1 and 2. The line of Cain did not survive the flood, so the Sethite-Cainite interpretation isn't correct. But if that's true, then who else might the sons of God and the daughters of men be? Another interpretation is that the sons of God are rulers and the daughters of men are common women. In support of this, it can be pointed out that the king of Israel was sometimes described as God's son. In Psalm 2, God tells the king, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." The problem is that the phrase sons of God is never applied to rulers like kings. This is an unknown usage in Hebrew. Worse yet, there is an established meaning for the phrase sons of God in biblical Hebrew, and it does not point to rulers. The standard Old Testament usage of the phrase sons of God refers to high-ranking members of God's heavenly court, or what we would call angels. Thus, at the beginning of the book of Job, we read, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." Deuteronomy 32:8 also says that when God divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, which reflects the ancient Israelite belief that God had assigned the nations to different angelic beings, but that he kept Israel for himself. But these angels went bad and began resisting God's will and were worshipped by men. You can see Deuteronomy 32:17 on that, for example. Thus, the Greek Septuagint of Psalm 96 says, all the gods of the nations are demons. And St. Paul similarly says in 1 Corinthians 10, what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. We see this reflected in Daniel 10, where the angel Gabriel tells how he was delayed for 3 weeks in answering Daniel's prayer by the demonic prince of Persia, how Gabriel needed help from Michael in battling him, and how he and Michael would then defeat the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece would come to prominence. The third interpretation of who the sons of God were in Genesis 6 is thus that they were angelic beings, and this would allow the phrase daughters of men to have its normal expected meaning of human women. But in recent centuries, the idea that angels mated with human women has struck many as incredible. Some have pointed to Jesus' statement that in the resurrection humans neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But that doesn't settle the matter because Jesus is describing angels in heaven, and he doesn't say that no angels ever abandoned their place in heaven and did things they weren't supposed to do. In fact, we know that some did. The New Testament book of Jude mentions the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority but left their proper dwelling. Other people have appealed to the fact that angels don't have physical bodies. The Catechism of the Catholic Church thus describes angels as spiritual, non-corporeal beings and as purely spiritual creatures who have intelligence and will. However, this doesn't mean that angels can't assume physical forms. For example, in Genesis 19, 2 angels arrive in Sodom to investigate the outcry against the city, and the men of the town attempt to rape them. Abraham's nephew Lot goes out of his house to try to talk them out of it, but things go badly, and the angels reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. This makes it sound very much like these 2 angels had temporarily assumed physical form. In the Middle Ages, Christian thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas held that angels could fashion temporary material bodies for themselves out of air. He also explained a way in which an angel, or rather a demon, might be able to father a child, which we'll get to in a bit. The fact is, the phrase sons of God, in the plural, is consistently used in the Old Testament to refer to high-ranking angels, which would support the third interpretation. Modern people tend to dismiss the third option because angels don't have physical bodies, but this is something that doctrinal development has made clear to us. This fact was not clear to the ancient Israelites, who didn't have a problem with embodied angels, and when trying to figure out what an ancient text means, we need to determine what it would have meant to the original author and his audience. Further, Christian thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas have held that even if angels don't normally have physical bodies, they can assume them. So before we set the third theory aside, let's consider what evidence we have for it. One of the books that some of the New Testament authors read was 1 Enoch. We know that because this book is directly quoted in Jude 14 and 15, which describes it as containing prophecy. In 1 Enoch, a group of angels decide to leave heaven and marry human women. They also teach mankind destructive skills like how to make weapons for war, how to make cosmetics for seduction, and how to perform magic. They corrupt mankind with these skills, and after they get married, their sons are violent giants, and the resultant corruption brings on the Great Flood. The fact is that the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6 is the most ancient one that we have on record. In the Word Biblical Commentary on Jude 6, the British scholar Richard Bauckham writes, according to Jewish tradition, angels descended from heaven to marry human wives and corrupt the human race in the period before the flood. This was how the account of the sons of God in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, was universally understood, so far as our evidence goes, until the mid-2nd century A.D., though the tradition took several varying forms. From the time of Rabbi Simeon Bar Yochai in the mid-2nd century A.D., the traditional exegesis was replaced in Judaism by an insistence that the sons of God were not angels but men. In Christianity, however, the traditional exegesis had a longer life, questioned only in the 3rd century and disappearing in the 5th century. This traditional exegesis was not limited to just one or two ancient sources. In the Word Biblical Commentary on Genesis 6:1, another British scholar, Gordon Wenham, writes, "The angel interpretation is at once the oldest view and that of most modern commentators. It is assumed in the earliest Jewish exegesis, for example, in the books of 1 Enoch, Jubilees, the Septuagint, Philo, Josephus, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The New Testament, 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6 and 7, and the earliest Christian writers, for example, Justin, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen, also take this line. The angelic interpretation of the sons of God in Genesis 6 is thus the universal and earliest view in both Jewish and Christian circles across a wide range of sources. What all of the sources have in common, though, is that they were all written in the period around the birth of Christ, either a few centuries before or afterward. But Genesis itself is from an earlier period, and how a text was later interpreted does not automatically tell you how it was interpreted at the time it was written. What would help us is if we had material from before Genesis was written that could shed light on the matter. And we do. One of the things that scholars of Genesis have noted is that its author frequently engages in anti-pagan polemics by giving an orthodox alternative interpretation to ideas from the surrounding pagan cultures. That's why in Genesis 1:16 the author says that God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, but he doesn't name them as the sun and the moon. The reason is that the words for sun and moon were also the names of the sun god and the moon god, and the author of Genesis doesn't want the reader thinking that the high god made the sun god and the moon god. The message is, they're just lights. Don't worship them. For those familiar with the ancient Near Eastern background that the author of Genesis is undermining, the background for Genesis 6 is clear. In Mesopotamian literature, there was a group of demigods known as the Apkallu. They were supposed to be wise and taught mankind the skills that made Mesopotamian civilization great. The Apkallu also mated with human women before the Great Flood and fathered divine human hybrid children who were Mesopotamian king heroes. The flood itself comes about differently in Mesopotamian mythology. There, the flood happened because the human race multiplied to such an extent that it was making too much noise at night and keeping the gods awake, so they sent the flood to get rid of the problem. It thus appears that the author of Genesis is rebutting these Mesopotamian ideas in his introduction to the flood narrative. Instead of the Apkallu being the good guys who made Mesopotamia great, the sons of God were fallen angels who abandoned heaven and improperly mated with human women, and the skills they taught corrupted mankind before the flood, which wasn't itself a petulant act of the gods because mankind was making too much noise. It was a just judgment sent because of man's wickedness. It thus looks like we have evidence for the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6, both before Genesis was written with the Mesopotamian Apkallu, and also after it was written in the Jewish literature from around the time of Christ. This provides significant support for the angelic interpretation, but is there any way we can confirm it? The book of Jude warns its readers against false teachers in Christian communities, and Jude warns about how God has sent judgment on wrongdoers in the past. In verses 6 and 7, he writes, "And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire." This passage refers to a group of angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling in heaven. That could be any group of fallen angels except for the next part of the verse, which says that Sodom and Gomorrah and surrounding cities likewise indulged in sexual immorality. If these earthly cities likewise did something, well, that means somebody else did it first. And in context, the individuals being referred to are the angels who left their proper dwelling. Only the Greek text is even clearer than this translation would suggest, because the word rendered likewise is a forward phrase in Greek that would literally be translated in the same manner as these. The plural word these points back to the previous plural noun angels. This is obvious when you read it in Greek because it can't refer to Sodom. That's a singular neuter noun. It also can't refer to Gomorrah. That's a singular feminine noun. And it can't refer to cities. That's a plural feminine noun. The word for these is a plural masculine noun, so it points to a plural masculine antecedent, and the only noun that will serve is the plural masculine noun angels. This makes it clear that Jude is saying that both the angels who left their dwelling in heaven and Sodom and the surrounding cities indulged in sexual immorality. The angels did so first, and then, in the same manner as these angels, Sodom and the cities of the plain did so as well. Jude's statement about the angels is thus an unmistakable reference to the events in Genesis 6, which is the only biblical passage he could be referring to. There's also a further aspect which also is not obvious in this translation. In addition to saying that these two groups indulged in sexual immorality, it also says that they pursued unnatural desire, but that's not what it literally says in Greek. The phrase used in Greek is that they pursued sarkos heteros, which would mean other flesh or different flesh. This points to something interesting. The men of Sodom are famous for attempting the homosexual rape of the two angels, who appeared to be men, and there are multiple passages in the Bible that condemn homosexuality. But this doesn't seem to be the aspect of the act that Jude is thinking of in this passage. If he were highlighting the homosexual aspect of what the Sodomites did, he would have expressed himself differently, because the apparently male flesh of the two angels would not be different, or in Greek, heteros, from that of the male Sodomites. Instead, it would be the same, or in Greek, homos. What was different was not the sex of the flesh, but the species to which it belonged. Commenting on Jude 7, Richard Bauckham states, sarkos heteros, strange flesh, cannot, as many commentators and most translations assume, refer to homosexual practice, in which the flesh is not different, heteros. It must mean the flesh of angels. The sin of the Sodomites, not strictly of the other towns, reached its zenith in this most extravagant of sexual aberrations, which would have transgressed the order of creation as shockingly as the fallen angels did. The fallen angels and the Sodomites, knowingly or unknowingly, were thus engaged in attempts to break the natural order by having sex with another species of God's creatures. Even if one disagrees on this point, the fact remains that Jude has an unmistakable reference to the events of Genesis 6 as involving angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling and indulged in sexual immorality. We thus have New Testament confirmation of the angelic interpretation of the sons of God in Genesis. But how could this be? How can we make sense of this passage if angels don't have physical bodies? There are a number of possibilities, because even if angels don't naturally have bodies, they can assume them. One way this happens is through demonic possession. Although I haven't seen this option explored in the literature, it would be hypothetically possible for a fallen angel to take possession of a man and then father offspring, perhaps using its angelic abilities to cause the children to grow to unusual height. In the Middle Ages, the common opinion among Christian thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas was that angels can assume temporary physical bodies that they condense out of the air. This explained passages in Scripture where the angels did physical things, like when two of them reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. Today, we have the atomic theory of matter rather than relying on the four classical elements of air, earth, fire, and water. But you can still propose that angels can assume temporary material bodies even if the underlying theory of matter has changed. Well, if they can do that, then could they use these bodies to generate the germ cells needed to impregnate a woman? Well, personally, I don't see why they couldn't. We already know that angels are able to psychokinetically interact with matter on the cellular level, as when David improperly takes a census and God sends an angel with a plague and punishment. If an angel can manipulate the microorganisms needed to cause a plague, I don't see why they couldn't similarly manipulate matter to produce germ cells. However, Thomas Aquinas had a different view. Based on the philosophy of Aristotle, he held that angels with aerial bodies could do some things that living people could do, like speaking by fashioning sounds in the air, but not others, like eating or reproducing. Still, he held that there was a way demons could father children. He quotes St. Augustine as saying that many persons affirm that they have had the experience or have heard from such as have experienced it, that the satyrs and fauns, which the common folk call incubi, have often presented themselves before women and have sought and procured intercourse with them. Hence, it is folly to deny it. Aquinas then concludes, if some are occasionally begotten from demons, it is not from the seed of such demons, nor from their assumed bodies, but from the seed of men taken for the purpose. As when the demon assumes first the form of a woman and afterwards of a man, just as they take the seed of other things for other generating purposes, as Augustine says, so that the person born is not the child of a demon, but of a man. In other words, a demon might first appear as a succubus, have sex with a man in order to gather his seed, and then change to the form of an incubus and have sex with a woman, impregnating her with the man's seed. The child would thus be fully human on this theory, as the sperm and egg it was born from both came from human parents. Still, this illustrates that there are ways demons could be said to father children, and I've just named 3 of them: through possession, through temporarily assumed bodies, and through Aquinas' succubus-incubus view. There are also other possibilities, and here it's important to remember that we're dealing with material that's found early in Genesis. As Blessed Pius XII points out, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, although properly speaking not conforming to the historical method used by the best Greek and Latin writers or by competent authors of our time, do nevertheless pertain to history in a true sense, which, however, must be further studied and determined by exegetes. The same chapters, in simple and metaphorical language adapted to the mentality of a people but little cultured, both state the principal truths which are fundamental for our salvation, and also give a popular description of the origin of the human race and the chosen people. Consequently, we shouldn't be too definite about exactly what happened that corresponds to the passage at the beginning of Genesis 6. Though these chapters pertain to history in a true sense, this sense must be further studied and determined by exegetes. It's one thing to figure out what the author said in simple and metaphorical language, but it's another to try to figure out what you would see if you could go back in time and witness the events for yourself. So, what have we learned in this episode? Earlier, I identified 7 questions that need to be answered about the text in Genesis 6. 1. Who are the sons of God in this passage? Well, we saw that the evidence strongly points to the sons of God being fallen angels. 2. Who were the daughters of men? Well, they're ordinary human women, just as the phrase daughters of men suggests. 3. Why does God say that man's days shall be 120 years? This likely refers to a 120-year grace period that God gives mankind before the flood. 4. Who were the Nephilim? The Nephilim were unusually tall people, or giants. 5. What is the relationship between the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim? The Nephilim, or giants, were the offspring of the fallen angels and the human women. 6. Why does the text say that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward? Because similar events with the fallen angels happened both before and after the flood, which is why the Israelites encountered Nephilim when they went into the Promised Land. 7. Do these events have anything to do with the Great Flood, which the passage introduces? Yes, the events with the fallen angels contribute to the wickedness of mankind that brought on the flood. Now, there are still things that we don't know about this mysterious passage, but a careful examination of the evidence reveals at least the outline of what the author's discussing. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and smash that bell notification so you'll always get notified when I have a new video. We're in our second year of the podcast now, and you can help me keep making the podcast for years into the future and get yourself early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you. I'll see you next time, and God bless you always.